All right, hey guys, last time we talked about the development of political and economic life in the British colonies in the Americas, and today we'll be talking about how a dominant culture begins to emerge in those colonies. We're also going to spend some time talking about the French and Indian Wars. So we got a lot to cover. Make sure to keep up, take good notes, pause if you need to, rewind if you need to, but we're going to be flying through this pretty quickly. All right, so some of the most important influences in colonial America are the developments of the Enlightenment and scientific revolution in Europe. You talked about those in World Civ. Of course, Enlightenment is this European movement that emphasized the search of knowledge, and is also called the Age of Reason. Along with that, you had the scientific revolution, in which people began to use observation and experimentation to look for, find, discover natural laws that govern the universe. So many of these scientists used those natural laws and tried to apply them to society as well, and find order in throughout the world, not just in the natural world, but also in the political and economic and the spiritual. So, Enlightenment thinkers in Europe believed that logic and reason could be used to improve society, whether it be through law, government, in religion. That the order of logic and reason could be applied to society as a whole. John Locke was one of these philosophers, a British philosopher, and he believed in the idea of natural rights. It was the duty of the government to protect citizens' natural rights, specifically life, liberty, and property. French philosopher Baron de Montesquieu believed in separation of powers. Voltaire, another Frenchman, criticized intolerance and prejudice. He specifically talked about freedom of speech and religious freedom. So many thinkers wanted to use some of these ideas to improve or reform society through education, reforms for criminal justice system, improving conditions for the poor, and all of these are going to have a huge impact on the formation of what will become the United States. John Locke specifically was widely read in the United States, at least by intellectuals who could read. Most Americans, most people in the colonies, obviously were not literate at the time, but people like Jefferson, Franklin, and other political leaders well knew what Locke had written and spoken about in his teaching. Now, obviously, Locke's ideas are going to become kind of the foundation later on for the Declaration of Independence, and also you have many Enlightenment ideas like Voltaire and Montesquieu that are present in the Constitution. But beyond that, the Enlightenment, or the founders specifically, had keen interest in science and invention. Franklin was one of the most prolific inventors in American history. Jefferson often invented ways to improve things around Monticello. So they were real deal Enlightenment thinkers of their time, and they were certainly influenced by European thought. As is often the case with periods of scientific advancement, people begin to question long-held religious beliefs and look for more scientific, rational explanations for how the universe worked or began or things of that nature. And as is often the case, the questioning of traditional religious ideas and values leads to a pushback from the church. Is going to become known as the Great Awakening. Specifically strict groups like the Puritans and other groups began to worry that material values and the idea of making money had replaced spiritual values. And so religious leaders start to look for ways to get people to return to the traditional values of the church. So this Great Awakening was a religious revival throughout the colonies, and two main leaders were Jonathan Edwards, who was a Puritan minister. He was your classic hellfire and brimstone preacher that kind of scared people back to church. Telling them all the horrible things that would happen to them in hell if they didn't repent their sins and return to the church. On the other hand, you had George Whitefield, who was a Methodist minister who had a very powerful voice and really stirred the emotions of his audiences, of his congregations, and moved them back into the fold, so to speak. But however it was done, the Great Awakening and all the different preachers that preached for revival led to a massive increase in church membership in the 1700s. Lots of new Protestant religions began to grow. You had Methodism, Baptist, Presbyterianism had been there from the beginning, but you had the growth of lots of different types of faiths throughout the colonies. And this Protestantism and this religious faith kind of becomes a uniting factor amongst all the colonies. Even though everybody does a little bit differently, it's still going to unite the colonies. And it's also going to lead to the creation of several early universities throughout the colony. And those colleges include most of the Ivy League: Princeton, Brown, Dartmouth. Many of those types of schools are founded as a direct result of the Great Awakening. So huge importance in U.S. culture. Also, during this time, the colonies were becoming more diverse. So one group was the Scotch Irish, who are not really necessarily Scots or Irish, but they're Presbyterians who had fled England, fled the Church of England, and settled in Ireland, and eventually settled in the Americas. But anyway, the Scots Irish, and the Scots and the Irish, all generally were hesitant to accept English authority, ready to push for political rights, and most of them settled in the Appalachian regions of the South, the Middle Colonies, Virginia, and in the Carolinas as well. And also there were large settlements in Pennsylvania as well. In Europe, you had more and more religious unrest, and the tolerance and the openness of the colonies attracted German colonists, many German Catholics and German Protestants as well, who became farmers and artisans oftentimes. Also, large numbers of French Huguenots who oftentimes became craftsmen and in scientific fields as well, were attracted to the colonies also. You also have the growth of small Jewish communities at times, specifically in the larger cities like Philadelphia and New York, but also in some of the more mid-sized city of Charleston and Newport. You have the growth of small Jewish communities that are going to become very influential and important for shaping American culture. Cities were very different during that time, and very similar also. I mean, the larger cities had your cobblestone, sometimes brick streets. You had the first paved streets at that time. Oil lamps were the street lights. Larger cities generally had busy harbors. People read a lot. People who could read a lot. Mail from relatives. There was a huge appetite for English newspapers and magazines. The larger cities had libraries and bookstores and lots of public buildings, places where people would go to plays or hear concerts. There were schools oftentimes for the wealthier residents of the city. Women in the city generally, they didn't have the farm labor, but generally they had domestic duties they were expected to perform, although the more prosperous ones had servants and could do more leisure activities. Letter writing was a huge time investment. People wrote letters, and you have a great historical record of letters from colonists back to Europe and so on and so forth. So that becomes a huge source of historical information and a wonderful resource for historians today. Colonists worked together in very tight-knit communities. You had quilt, people get together and quilt, or communities would come up and build barns for their neighbors, visiting one another. You had hunting expeditions, horse race, all sorts of different things that people did together. It was a much less fragmented society than we have today, obviously. The main form of mass communication at that time, obviously, was through the printing press. Newspapers, books, and the like were important ways to get out mass messages to people. Of course, newspapers sprout up very quickly in major cities, and very quickly also come to a problem when John Peter Zenger, who's a New York printer, published articles criticizing the royal governor of New York. He's arrested, newspaper was burned, but he wins an important early case for freedom of the press in the American colonies. He winds up getting off. And his acquittal is going to be an important early victory for freedom of the press, and we'll later see that obviously reflected in the Constitution. Now, Black Americans, though they weren't considered Americans yet, obviously, also were developing culture during this time, even though they're slaves. The family structure was very important to slaves. Even though oftentimes families were split apart, you have these wide networks of kinship, distant relatives and things like that become very important to blacks and enslaved blacks and free blacks as well. Religion is also another strength of the community. It's one of the few places where blacks can be away from white eyes in many cases. Also, slave community preserves music and dance traditions from Africa, and many of the musical and food and other cultural markers from Africa that slaves held on to actually become major parts of American culture. Most of the music that you guys listen to, whether it's country, rock, or hip hop, is a direct descendant of Black American music and Afro-Caribbean roots. Now, as we talked about a few videos ago, at this time, it's not just English in North America. You also have Spain active in the southern part of the colonies, and also in what eventually becomes the West, and then the Midwest, you have France pushing down from Canada. That's going to lead to conflict. We're going to talk about the French Indian War. It's important because it really sets the stage for the American Revolution later on. And the French and Indian War is really one theater of a larger war between France and Britain called the 7 Years' War. And you learned about it in World Civ. It kind of begins in the colonies, but very soon spreads into a global conflict between the two nations. It's called the French and Indian War because most of the Indian groups do side with the French, who they've been trading with years, have a much better relationship in general than with British colonists. However, there is one group, the Iroquois League, that does sign an alliance with the British. So French and Indian War is kind of a misnomer, but anyway, Indian groups kind of fight on whichever side they think is going to give them the best deal oftentimes. So the first skirmish in the French and Indian War is at Fort Duquesne, which is near present-day Pittsburgh. The French had built a fort there. The British basically sent a militia led by George Washington to take the land from the French, and it was actually a disastrous military expedition. Washington loses most of the troops. They don't take the fort, and it becomes an embarrassment for the British in effect. It's during this time that Ben Franklin comes up with the Albany Plan, which is basically the first plan to unite the colonies in a confederation where they would each have their own constitution, but they would elect a Grand Council, appoint a Grand Council to basically deal with foreign issues and expansion, Native Americans and things of that nature. It wasn't approved, but it's an important first step. So initially the war goes pretty badly for Britain. They're getting beat by the French, and British officers in America are not winning themselves any friends. They're forcing colonists in the army. They're conscripting people. They're seizing supplies. They're forcing people to board soldiers in their homes. So colonists resist those actions, and so fewer and fewer colonists are helping to fight. So the British send more of their own soldiers, which increases troop levels there. Kind of leads to some of the conflicts that are going to raise their head later. However, by 1758, the British had kind of turned the momentum and began winning the war. 1759, the British capture of Quebec is kind of the final straw that breaks the camel's back, and the French surrendered in 1760. The Treaty of Paris ends the war, and Britain gains basically all French colonies in North America, much of Canada, all of the territory east of the Mississippi, and also Spain had supported France, so Spain had to give up much of Florida to Great Britain, and it got from France basically what becomes known as Louisiana Territory. So France was able to keep a couple islands near Canada and did regain some of the Caribbean islands, but by and large it was a big win for the British, and they emerge as the major world power. So the war has far-reaching impacts, one of which is American industry profits from the war and becomes more of a competitor for European industry. Also, the slave owners benefit, specifically in the Carolinas and Georgia, because now slaves can't just run away and hide in Florida under Spanish control. Also, the war is the first time that colonists begin to talk about unification. Also, British officials thought that the colonists should pay some expenses of the war. So in 1760, George Grenville, the British Prime Minister, instituted strict policies that alienated colonists more. You're going to see that become a big impact later on. Also, Chief Pontiac wanted to drive the British out of former French territory, which led to a 3-year-long conflict called Pontiac's Rebellion. It also led to the process of pushing natives further